Welcome to IIIT Ismail Raji Alfa Rookie Memorial Lecture 2021. As you know, my name is, some of you may know me, I see some names. My name is Muhammad Shafiq. I'm the moderator of this session. I'm really thankful to IIIT for asking me to moderate it. I'm professor here at Nazareth College in the Religious Studies Department. I teach world religions and interfaith and Islamic studies here. I'm also the executive director of the Hickey Center, as well as I hold the IIIT chair for interfaith studies and dialogue. As far as Faruqi is concerned, nobody knows more than our Hisham Altalib, which I will introduce him in a minute. But Faruqi, I just want to give you one thing. He was not only academician that you see Christian ethics from Aruba to the Islamic Atlas, but other writings of him as a top academician. But he was really an activist. I just want to give you one thing, and then I will introduce Dr. Hisham Altalib. Faruqi in 78 almost, when we saw that Warisuddin Muhammad has taken over the nation of Islam. I was president of MSA Regional also since I came to America in 76. So having very close relationship and running Al-Faruqi program, overseas guests and others. He said, Shafiq, what do you think? This is opportunity to invite Warisuddin Muhammad. I have heard that he's initiating Islam, to Islamize, I'm using that word, the nation of Islam. So I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So finally we got in contact, amazing phenomena that how the nation of Islam came to the teaching of Al-Islam, and slowly and gradually, and what happened through that process, and how we picked up Hamoud Abdullati Islam in focus to be taught to everyone. And then Faruqi said, look, the imams will be, they were called ministers at that time, will be upset with us if we do not give them a training. And then that training happened also. So you can see Al-Faruqi vision for education, for the, to see how things should happen and how things should be organized. Personally, I have learned a lot from him, a lot of influence. That's why when I came on Fulbright, I did my research in Al-Faruqi, which is published, Growth of Islamic Thought in North America, focus on Al-Faruqi. I was thinking to do the same thing on Fazlur Rahman and then on Sayyid Hussein Nasser, because all of them were very close to me and all of them have influence. But Faruqi, I have been for 5-6 years with him as somebody who, he trusted me and somebody who can carry on what he wants. So I got that training from him, how to organize, how to run programs, and how to lead the community. So that's what I learned from him. But someone who has very been close to him, who is a friend, who is a colleague, and who has worked together with him throughout that period, along with some others, to establish the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. He knows him better because the way they work, the way they were associated, and also is not only that he worked for IIIT to be established with Al-Faruqi, but running, that was Muslim Student Association before 80s, and then Muslim Social Scientists, and also other organization that he was part of it. So having that way of Islamic knowledge and writing about, what he was concerned more as Muslim youth training, which I learned from his book also, what he wrote, Dr. Hisham Altalib wrote his book on, excuse me, his training guide for Islamic workers. read that and I benefited, and I quoted his book and my other book, quite a few things from there in Islamic Dawah. And also his book on inviting to Islam, Ethics of Engagement. Both of those two books, very useful, especially for college students. And I have learned quite a bit. So he knows about Alfa Rookie, who he was and the work Alfa Rookie did. Without any delay, I would like to invite Dr. Hisham Altalib to give us his close relationship with Alfa Rookie and the establishment of IIIT. This is important that we know the background, why these lectures are happening on memorial lectures on Alfa Rookie, and then we will go to our keynote speaker. Dr. Hisham Altalib, you have 15 minutes to give us some background.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. I'll speak on several issues about the late المرحوم Ismail Raji Faruqi as time allows. I will touch on who he was, the Eid Party in Louisiana State University, the training program guide that we established, education curriculum according to Alfa Rookie, the institutional that he participated in and established and founded, and some of his thought of interest to us. So who was Alfa Rookie? What was he made of? He was born in 1921 in Palestine and was assassinated in Philadelphia, 1986 in May. Together with his wife in the same night of that Ramadan. He was a mujahid against colonization. He learned Arabic in his home and in the mosque, and he learned the French because he attended the French boarding school in Palestine for practically all his high school and intermediate school, as well as the primary school. So he mastered French language, he mastered Arabic language, and then he went to AUB, American University of Beirut, to master the English language. And actually, he also mastered the German language. I say mastered because he used to talk about it, write in these languages, and even think in these languages. He became the Hakim al-Khalil, Hebron, governor in 1945, and they say this was the youngest man to occupy that post. He mastered the depth of knowledge of religions and philosophy. He taught and attended so many academic institutions and universities. I'll just go through them quickly. American University of Beirut, Indiana University, Harvard University, Al-Azhar University, McGill University, Chicago University, Syracuse. And actually, he was a colleague of Fazlur Rahman, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, and Naqib al-Attas of Malaysia. So al-Marhum Fazlur Rahman, he invited him in Karachi to be working with him for research in the Central Institute for Islamic Research of Pakistan. So he has been very well versed in many things. Academically speaking, I think there are so many publications and lectures and so on about him, but really, let me tell you what is his identity, as narrated by him personally. He said, I started in a phase to prove academically, scholarship-wise, and even material-wise, as a Western man, a successful man. When I became acceptable, and I made my mark, then I felt that after all this success, there is no meaning for me. So I asked myself, who am I? Am I a Palestinian? Am I an Arabist? Am I a philosopher? Am I a humanist liberal? My answer came, I am a Muslim. So that was really who Al-Faruqi was. Now, he was so humble. He told us that he tasted the religion of Islam and the faith in a practical way at the house of Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, who was studying at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was president of the MSA of the university. So Al-Faruqi was the advisor of that association, MSA local chapter. So Faruqi says, I witnessed some of their meetings of this MSA people in the house of Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman and Sister Fa'iq al-Malaika. And I saw how they cook, they eat, they wash dishes, they pray, they listen to lectures, they sleep on the floor, they love each other. So he said, that is how I tasted the real meaning of Iman and Islam. In fact, he was so humble later on that I heard him once in the regional conference of the MSA in Montreal in 1967. He said, actually, MSA is my teacher. Of course, he was the teacher of MSA himself, but he was so humble to say that. Now, the Dean of the College of Divinity, Stanley Bryce Frost at the McGill University, he also described Al-Faruqi, which will help us how to understand the identity of Al-Faruqi. So Stanley Frost says that Al-Faruqi was the man of the East and West worlds, the two worlds, in depth, but he did not find peace, security, and serenity, tuma'nina and sakina, unless later on when he actually became, like Dr. Shafiq was saying, an activist indeed in the United States and also abroad. So Ghulam Nabi Faye, who was one of the brilliant students of Faruqi, he summarizes the Faruqi aspects. He was not only an academician and scholar, but he was also an activist. He connected the theory and academy with practice. Now, let me tell you about one major incident that Dr. Jamal Barzanchi, rahmatullahi alayhi, narrated to me. He was in LSU, Louisiana State University, doing his PhD in chemical engineering. He said, I invited Dr. Faruqi in 1972 for an Eid party in end of Ramadan. And the party participants were open to all students, Muslim and non-Muslims, faculty, clergy, and they listened to Al-Faruqi for about 1 hour speaking about various religions and Christianity and so on. So when he stopped speaking, there was a Q&A. The first one to raise his hand was a pastor in the congregation in that meeting. So people were stunned. What will this man say about Faruqi? He said, I have a confession to make. Tonight, listening to Al-Faruqi, I learned about Christianity more than I learned from studying it for 30 years in my life. So that was really the depth of the knowledge of Al-Faruqi. He explained how really the Christianity we know today is not the pure Christ, Isa alayhi salam Christianity. He calls it Pauline Christianity, because this St. Paul, he introduced many things that are not of the teaching of Jesus alayhi salam, and he in fact he massacred some of the disciples who opposed him because of his idea. According to Faruqi, that St. Paul actually corrupted the pure principle of Tawheed that Jesus brought from God. Now, in McGill University, Wilfred Smith, he invited Al-Faruqi for 2 years to live with the clergy and the priest for 2 full years to really understand the essence of the Christianity, not only the academic and scholarship. So the result of this 2 years of Al-Faruqi, he wrote a book called Christian Ethics in 1967. And they hesitated to publish it because, according to some of the Christian scholars, any Christian who reads this book, Christian Ethics of Al-Faruqi, the foundation of what he knows about Christianity will be shaken. So that was actually the depth of Al-Faruqi in religion. I interacted with Al-Faruqi a lot, especially when the MSA entrusted me to establish the leadership training program department in the MSA at Indiana, Plainfield in Indiana. And I consulted with Al-Faruqi. He said simply, anybody who is like calling for Islam, he should be like a good salesman, and salesman must know the good that he is selling. So he said they should learn about the isms, the religions, the ideologies in their environment. And that includes, of course, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, secularism, and other things. And in my program, this training program, which lasted for several years, I used to invite him regularly to enlighten us about these things. As far as Islam, he said, we actually, as MSA, we entrusted him to write the book of what Islam is, and he came up with an excellent book, one of the best according to many Muslims, scholars, and so on, called At-Tawheed, its implication and concepts. And it is, according to many, one of the best books written about Tawheed, not only contemporary times, but also in the legacy of Islam. Now, I come to some special ideas of Al-Faruqi, his opinion of the education curriculum that is being followed by all over the world now. He has some unique concepts. He said, my children had the best Western education, but I am not satisfied with this type of curriculum and the product. He said, the teacher should be like al-uswatul hasana, the good model example of the students, by living together, and like this system of the old sheikh and ustad in the mosque, starting at the dawn up to Isha prayer, living and learning and eating and praying and making activity together as a role model for the students. He does not approve of the long holidays in the curriculum, like a few weeks in Christmas, a few 3-4 months in the summer, in the Easter, couple of weeks, all this. He said, this is really a waste of time. In his concept of rest and vacation, he says that if you are studying, let's say, religion, and you feel tired, go and change the subject. That's how you feel comfortable. Read physics, or read psychology, or read math, history, whatever. So that is, you don't have to be idle sitting to get rest. And he says that in the summer, instead of we give 3-4 months to the children, they should go to the villages and teach the farmers there the vocational thing, like being electrician, plumbing, carpentry, reading and writing, building, contracting, all these things. He said that's what the students should do in the summer, rather than just waste 3 months of their precious time. Then I will come to Faruqi as an institutional mind. He actually established, personally with many founders, several institutions, like to start with AAUG, American Arab University graduate. Then the AMSS with Abdul Hamid, Ahmed Tutunchi, myself, Dr. Jamal Barzinchi in 1972. And this AMSS actually, it is a precursor to the IIIT. The IIIT founders were actually Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, Dr. Faruqi, rahmatullah alayh, Dr. Taha Jabir Al-Alwani, Dr. Jamal Barzinchi, Dr. Ahmed Tutunchi, Datu Siri Anwar Ibrahim from Malaysia, and Hisham Altalib. Those were the 7 founders of the IIIT. Now, the whole idea was of the IIIT, I'll finish in a minute, inshallah, that he thinks that the Muslim world is going through blind imitation. Either the seculars imitate blindly the Western culture, or the traditional try to re-implant the history, the golden ages of Islam in the history. And he says both of them will not work. What will work is, that is the purpose of AMSS and IIIT exactly, is ijtihad, original creative research in the scriptures, Quran and Sunnah and other scriptures, human achievements of Muslim legacy as well as Western legacy, and come up with the methodology of studying the science and the research. So he, in the Islamabad in 1982, we were invited by the International Islamic University of Pakistan, and there about 80 scholars came from all over the world. Maybe half of them are passed away now, if no more. And from that conference, there were 3 major papers, one by Sheikh Taha Jabir Al-Alwani, one by Dr. Abdul Hamid, one by Dr. Faruqi, and he wrote, Faruqi edited these 3 papers in a booklet called The General Principles and the Work Plan, Islamization of Knowledge. Now we changed it to Integration of Knowledge. One more minute, Dr. Shafiq, and I'll finish some of the ideas. He said a Muslim student should teach. He's a professor. In Cyprus, I was in charge of World Assembly of Muslim Youth Camp, International Camp, in 1979. I invited him to speak to us. He came. So I asked him some question in my mind. I said, Faruqi, do you have any issues about Islam, Quran, and so? He said, yes, I have many issues, but I go to Ibn Taymiyyah and I find the perfect solution. He said, many people think that these ideas are mine. They are not. They are Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas. He interacted with foreign students and indigenous African American Muslims. He said, each of them can contribute something. We should have both of them, and we should have mu'akhat among both. In other words, brotherhood and sisterhood among the indigenous Muslims, especially the African American and the foreign students who come from all over the world. And he says, actually, the Muslim community is our university. I will end up here, and barakallah fikum, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisham Altalib. And surely we will have some question for you at the end about Alfa Rookie life and from Aruba to his universal thinking about Islam. So we'll have that, but we have our main speaker today, Dr. SherAli Tareen. He is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. He got his PhD from Duke University. So he's pretty young in 2012. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early modern and modern period of South Asia. His book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, received a book prize and was selected as a finalist from the 2021 AAR Book Award. So that's a great prestige. Congratulations, Dr. SherAli Tareen. His other book is in progress, which is The Promise and Pearl of Hindu-Muslim Friendship. So as you see, his concentration is on South Asia as a whole. today he will be speaking to us, debating inter-religious friendship after empire, which is, I think, Mughal Empire, which we're talking about. So that is debating inter-religious friendship after empire. You can, those who are here, you can put your question in chat box, and also you can ask personally also when we come to, he has to, Dr. Tareen, you have to speak for 40 minutes, and then we will open it to Q&A. Dr. SherAli Tareen.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Dr. Shafiq, for that very kind and generous introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Talib, for that really beautiful and rich presentation and talk. MashaAllah, that was really incredible. And I also really want to thank Solat Pervez for all her efforts in making this event possible. It really is a profound honor and privilege, and a really humbling privilege to be giving this lecture, which bears the name of an intellectual giant like Ismail Faruqi. So this is a tremendous honor, and thank you everyone joined to this event for your time and for your patience. Thank you so much. So I'll jump right into my comments. So today I will be sharing with you some fragments from my current book project called The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship, which looks at intra-Muslim debates, especially among the traditionally educated ulama, on the boundaries of inter-religious friendship, especially Hindu-Muslim friendship from late 18th to mid-20th century South Asia. The central question or theme that I want to explore today is this: how did modern South Asian Muslim scholars, especially the seminary or madrasa educated traditionalist ulama, negotiate the incongruence between the pre-modern context of Muslim empire that informed foundational normative attitudes towards non-Muslims and the setting of colonial modernity that saw Muslims in South Asia rendered into a numerical as well as a political minority? In simpler words, how did they imagine and engage the legacy of dominant pre-modern texts on Muslim, non-Muslim relations in a world in which the political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty that had informed those texts was no longer available? I will make two arguments today. One, I will argue and show that South Asian Muslim scholarly discourses and disputes over Hindu-Muslim friendship cannot be reduced to and explained by predetermined and popular liberal secular binaries like inclusivist, exclusivist, pluralist, Puritan, modernist, traditionalist, pro-Western, anti-Western, or violent, peaceful. The thinkers I will consider and their thought are far too complex and non-linear for such a possibility. And two, I will argue that in South Asian ulama imaginaries, in the absence of political sovereignty after the fall of the Mughal Empire in the 19th century, Muslim sovereign power was increasingly located in and exercised through the regulation of everyday ritual life and practice in the public sphere. Muslim sovereignty and dominance over non-Muslims, a defining ingredient of an imperial political theology, in turn, was increasingly equated with the preservation of markers of Muslim ritual distinction, Sha'air Allah, singular Shi'ar Allah, Sha'air Islam, or singular Shi'ar Islam. In explaining this argument, let me begin by elaborating what I mean by an imperial Muslim political theology. For this, for the first quarter of this talk, I will spend some time in the pre-modern period before entering modern South Asia. So what do I mean by an imperial Muslim political theology? By this category, I mean the conjoining of the aspiration for Muslim sovereign power over other faith communities with the assumption of theological superiority over them. The Islamic legal tradition developed in a pre-modern context of Islamdom that presumed the establishment and maintenance of Muslims' political dominance and theological superiority over non-Muslims as an underlying purpose of law. As the scholar Johann Friedman, in his encyclopedic survey of pre-modern Muslim intellectual attitudes towards non-Muslims called Tolerance and Coercion in Islam, sums up, and I quote him here, "The idea of Muslim superiority is central to the pre-modern Islamic worldview and figures prominently in numerous chapters of Islamic law and tradition." End of quote. This sentiment is best captured in the Prophet's well-known statement, "Islam is exalted and nothing is exalted over it." This principle of Islam's exaltedness, Friedman argued, continued to exert decisive normative pressure on pivotal Muslim intellectual traditions, especially Islamic law, in the centuries following the Prophet's life, with the Abbasid period holding particular significance as the immediate context of the formations of the Muslim jurisprudential tradition. It also served as a crucial underpinning in the formulation of Muslim legal and normative positions concerning the application of a range of questions involving non-Muslims, including admissibility of testimony, participation in jihad, laws of retribution, and the public display and performance of devotional rituals. Among the earliest and most fascinating, though less studied articulation of an imperial Muslim political theology in the context of Islam's relationship with other religions is found in the curious 10th century Muslim philosopher Abul Hasan al-Amiri, died 992 of the Gregorian calendar. His Arabic text, The Proclamation of the Virtues of Islam, Al-I'lam bi Manaqib al-Islam, henceforth the Proclamation. This text comes close to the modern genre of comparative religion, though it bears an explicit interest in establishing Islam's superiority over other religious traditions, specifically Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Sabianism, and polytheism that Al-Amiri called Al-Wathaniya. A native of Nishapur, then an intellectual hub of Muslim scholarship, especially philosophy, under the Sunni Iranian Samanid Empire that ruled from 819 to 999, Al-Amiri, like many other scholars of his time, led a life full of travels that included extended stints of learning and teaching in prominent intellectual centers like Baghdad, Ray, and Bukhara. He was a student of the famous philosopher and geographer Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, died 934, who in turn studied with the even more famous doyen of Muslim philosophy, the 9th century scholar Abu Yusuf al-Qindi, died 873, best known as the philosopher of the Arabs. A signature feature of al-Qindi's philosophical temperament that al-Amiri also adopted and aired in his work centered on its attempted coalescence of the revealed and non-revealed sources of knowledge. The first few chapters of the Proclamation, a text of 10 chapters and 4 appendices of varied length, are devoted to this task of establishing a mutually reinforcing relationship between religious knowledge, as found in disciplines like hadith, law, and theology, and non-religious knowledge traditions like logic, the natural sciences, medicine, mathematics, mineralogy, and astrology, in addition to some others. The bulk of the text formulates a method of interreligious comparison and then applies that method to establish Islam's superiority over the other 5 religions. In a gesture eerily reminiscent of modern or even contemporary world religions textbooks, Al-Amiri posited 5 defining features held in common by all religious traditions: doctrines of faith, i'taqadat, rituals of worship, ibadat, societal relations, mu'amalat, and punishments against transgressions, mazajir. Each of these domains of religion, in turn, were divided into 5 constituent parts. For instance, the category of rituals of worship included prayers, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, and, curiously, jihad. The comparative method, he declared, must compare and evaluate equivalent and corresponding elements in these 5 major domains across religious traditions, with careful attention that defective or less important aspects of a given religion are not brought under the ambit of evaluation. Most critically, he punctuated that establishing the superiority of Islam, Al-Amiri referred to Islam as Al-Millah Al-Hanafiya, over other religions, must entail a process and outcome that are rationally persuasive and logically coherent. In each category, he presented Islam as the balanced middle path that avoids the excessive harshness or leniency found in other religions. But the part of this text and of Al-Amiri's intellectual imaginary that most interests me here, in the context of describing the lineaments of an imperial Muslim political theology, involves his interlocking of religious knowledge and the doctrines and rituals that derive from that knowledge, and political power and sovereignty. Among the central qualities that distinguished Islam from other religions, in his view, was its emphasis on combining prophetic knowledge and wisdom, al-ilm wal-hikmah, with political power and gravitas, al-iqtidar wal-hayba. Al-Amiri summed up his conception of the intimate relationship between religion and political sovereignty in these vivid words, and I quote him here. Religion, he said, to political sovereignty is what the foundation is to a structure, and political sovereignty to religion is what the base of support is to pillars. محل الدين من الملك محل الأس من البنيان ومحل الملك من الدين محل المتعهد من الأركان. In other words, the mutual reinforcement of religion and political sovereignty represented a mirror image. For Al-Amiri then, superiority over other religions in faith and ritual practice required the presence and maintenance of imperial political sovereignty. A similar hierarchy of religious difference animated by an imperial logic of maintaining Muslim power and distinction over non-Muslims, primarily Christians and Jews, sustained the famous 14th century legal compendium, Legal Rulings on Non-Muslims Under Muslim Rule, Ahkam Ahl al-Dhimma, by the Hanbali jurist Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, died 1350. In a fascinating and probing recent study of Ahkam Ahl al-Dhimma called Minding Their Place, Antonia Bosanquet convincingly argues that though this hugely influential and well-known text of Ibn al-Qayyim's is certainly a legal compendium, it is much more than a legal compendium. Further, it articulates and presents a meticulous and detailed blueprint of the spatial, political, and affective geographies that must distinguish Muslims and non-Muslims under Islamdom, in arenas of life ranging from places of worship and burial, employment and services, business and commercial exchange, gestures of greeting, marriage and familial relations, and sites of everyday encounters such as public festivals. Bosanquet shows that akin to, though not identical to, his luminary teacher Ibn Taymiyyah, died 1328, it is precisely through the calibrated and careful regulation of Muslim non-Muslim spaces and choreographies of interaction in everyday life that Ibn al-Qayyim sought to establish and preserve Islam's politico-theological superiority. In other words, a political theology of Muslim imperial power was expressed and reinforced through a spatial cartography of religious hierarchy and distinction. Now, a clarification is in order here. Obviously, it would be perilous to assume seamless correspondence between the normative ideal and principle of establishing Muslim superiority over non-Muslims and the everyday unfolding of relations among and between different religious communities. Fissures and inconsistencies between scripted ideals and unscripted rhythms of intercommunal encounters are inevitable in any time period. Moreover, the logics, textures, and operations of Muslim caliphal authority and political sovereignty certainly varied across time and space in the pre-modern world. There is no pre-modern monolith. That is not the point. Rather, the point being that an imperial political theology anchored on the assumption of Muslim political and theological supremacy over non-Muslims served as a critical backdrop to the formation of the canonical sources of knowledge, such as, say, the Hanafi legal canon that dominates South Asia. Now, with this conceptual background and anchor in place, let me now move to the context of modern South Asia that forms the focus of my comments today. From the late 18th century onwards, though increasingly a colonized minority, the interpretive canvas that often informed South Asian Muslim scholarly engagements with the question of Islam and difference, or Muslim non-Muslim relations, remained deeply anchored in this pre-modern context of Muslim imperial sovereignty that I just described. This did not mean, of course, that South Asian Muslim scholars were somehow stuck in the pre-modern world. To the exact contrary, and this is central to my argument today, the persistence of an imperial Muslim political theology was intimately bound to the conditions, expectations, and pressures of colonial modernity. For a deracinated colonized minority that had lost its political sovereignty, this moment was saturated with the anxiety of recovering the distant yet urgently attractive fantasy of sovereign power. To repeat, my main argument today is this. With the impossibility of political sovereignty This desire for sovereign power was increasingly exercised in the realm of everyday ritual life through the drive to preserve and maintain markers of Muslim distinction. Sha'air-e-Islam, singular, Sha'air-e-Islam, meaning ritual practices of everyday life that distinguish religious identity and difference in the public sphere. Now, how is this so? For the remainder of this talk, I will present and explain two examples, among many other possible examples, but just two examples to illustrate this broad argument. Example 1. Among the most fascinating moments of intra-Muslim contest on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim relations concern the context of the Khilafat movement in the early 20th century, exactly 1 century ago. What was the Khilafat movement? The Khilafat movement was initiated in 1919 by a group of Muslim political leaders and intellectuals, several of whom were educated at Western institutions of learning, although it also included many prominent traditionalist ulama. The specific objective of this movement was to pressure the British colonial government to preserve the geographic boundaries and the spiritual and political authority of the Ottoman Caliphate in the aftermath of World War I. At the center of its platform was the Muslim imperial ideal of restoring the eroding symbolic capital and political power of the institution of the Caliphate, an institution that the leaders of the Khilafat movement associated with the Ottoman state. As a way to meet that objective, the leaders of the Khilafat movement actively collaborated with and supported Gandhi's and the Indian National Congress's anti-colonial non-cooperation movement that had called all Indians to sever all economic and civic ties with the British colonial state. Although the Khilafat movement did not succeed as the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922, it brought into view a pressing theological and political dilemma: the normative boundaries of interreligious friendship in the colonial context. To put it simply, the dilemma for Indian Muslims and Indian Muslim scholars was this: do we ally with the Hindu community as a way to build a unified political front to oppose and pressure the British? Or is such Hindu-Muslim alliance and friendship harmful to Islam and Muslim identity? Let me briefly describe the intra-Muslim debate or intra-ulama debate sparked by this dilemma by first turning to the thought of the renowned Muslim scholar and one of the key intellectual architects of the Khilafat movement, called Abul Kalam Azad, died 1958. Azad was a journalist, scholar, and politician whose erudition and literary abilities were legendary. The youngest person at age 35 to become the president of the Congress Party in 1923, he also served as the first Minister of Education in post-independence India. Azad was homeschooled and received a traditional Muslim education, including training in Arabic and Persian poetry by his father, Khairuddin Hussaini, a noted scholar in his own right who, like many anti-colonial activists of his generation, had fled to Mecca, then part of the Ottoman Empire, from India after the ill-fated 1857 rebellion against the British. Azad was born in Mecca in 1888. His family resettled in Calcutta a couple years later, where he was raised. But his emotive and intellectual attachment to Arabia and Arab scholars only tightened over time, in equal part through travels in the region and through concomitantly forged transnational scholarly relations and collaborations. Azad, for example, was a close associate of his more than 3 decades senior, Rashid Rida, died 1935, the eminent Egyptian modernist. A genuine polyglot who frequently traversed varied disciplines like philosophy, poetry, law, and Quranic exegesis, Azad was also the founder of the short-lived but hugely influential newspaper, the weekly newspaper Al-Hilal, the Crescent, that operated from 1912 to 1914 and served as an important and widely disseminated platform of anti-colonial thought and activism. Categorizing Azad as a Muslim scholar is difficult. He was certainly a modernist in his desire to align Muslim knowledge traditions and normativity with modern expectations on questions of interreligious friendship and later constitutional democracy. But yet he was also fiercely anti-colonial and deeply attached to the sovereign promise of a Muslim caliphal state. He was well versed in and a beneficiary of modern Western knowledges. But yet, as I just mentioned, he was also well-rounded in a rather expansive gamut of the Muslim humanities. In my comments, though, today, I will examine some fragments of a lesser-known but immensely important and fascinating work of his in Urdu, peppered with Arabic references, entitled The Arabian Peninsula, Jaziratul Arab, also known with the title The Problem of the Caliphate, Mas'ala-e Khilafat, composed in 1920, a moment when the Ottoman Caliphate had considerably weakened politically, and 6 years after Britain and the Allied forces had declared war against the Ottomans in World War I, this roughly 200-page text strives to establish the necessity of the Caliphate according to the Sharia. Azad's central argument was steeped in an imperial Muslim imaginary. That argument, put simply, was this: the institution of the Caliphate, currently represented by the Ottomans, constituted a foundational, indispensable, and non-negotiable tenet of Islam. Azad explained the Caliphate's centrality to Islam with an evocative agricultural analogy. The institution of the Caliphate, he argued, is the root of the Sharia, while obligatory practices like praying and fasting are its branches. The normative foundations of the religion depended on the existence of the Caliphate. Therefore, while not praying or fasting constituted a sin, not aiding a Muslim caliph, especially during a time of war, made one a non-Muslim. In Azad's view, the centrality of the Caliphate to Islam was not only a theological or political imperative, rather the criticality of a singular central locus of Muslim politico-theological power and sovereignty represented a manifestation of a universal law of centrality, Qanun-e-Markaziyat, that pervaded all aspects of life, nature, and cosmology. For instance, the movement and existence of stars hinges and pivots on the centrality of the sun as their source of energy. The body is composed of several organs, each with its specialized function, but their functioning depends on the central organ of the heart. Similarly, in the world of botany, a tree is composed of several elements, including leaves, branches, and flowers, but its sustenance is tethered to a singular center of gravity, the roots. And finally, while there was more than one hallowed site in space in Islam, the central fulcrum of Muslim devotional life and piety was the Kaaba in Mecca. These were all examples that confirmed the universality of the law of centrality. The institution of the Caliphate was to Islam, Azad analogized, what the heart, sun, and roots were to the body, stars, and trees. Theologically and cosmologically, the Caliphate was necessary and indispensable. But, and this point is crucial to my larger argument today, Azad's reliance on an imperial Muslim political theology did not in any way undermine his cognizance of the secularizing conditions and claims of British colonial power. In fact, at the centerpiece of his acerbic critique of the British colonial state was the contention that by adopting a policy of aggression against the Ottoman Caliphate, the British had compromised its own official promise of secularism and freedom of religion, the Urdu word is mazhabi azadi, for all communities in India. Moreover, by intervening in a matter of religious importance for Indian Muslims, the Caliphate, the British had contravened its own secular principle of the separation of religion and politics. Therefore, he called on Indian Muslims to avidly collaborate with Gandhi's and the Indian National Congress's non-cooperation movement by severing all civic ties with the colonial state. But Azad went a step further by declaring that it was obligatory on every Indian Muslim, it was a fardul ayn, to wage jihad against the British, since at stake was the protection of the Caliphate from non-Muslim aggression. For Azad, in the political conditions that existed in 1920, it was no longer possible for Indian Muslims to remain loyal citizens of the British Empire while also remaining loyal to the Sharia. In assembling his argument, now how did he make this argument? In assembling his argument, Azad drew on two intensely contested verses in the Quran, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 60, Al-Mumtahana, relevant parts of which read as follows, and I'll go slowly so you can follow. These verses read, the relevant parts of these verses read as follows. It says, God does not forbid you from showing kindness to those unbelievers who do not fight you on account of your faith and neither drive you forth from your homes. God only forbids you to turn in friendship towards those unbelievers who do fight against you because of your faith and drive you forth from your homes or aid others in driving you forth. In the context of colonial India, Azad argued, Hindus represented the first category of non-Muslims, those who do not fight you because of your faith, mentioned in these Quranic verses. Why? Because he argued they had never attacked Muslim countries, fought them in religion, or been the cause of the expulsion of Muslims from their lands. In stark contrast, the British, with their designs to colonize Arabia and destroy the Ottoman Caliphate, exemplified non-Muslims of the second variety, those who fought Muslims in religion and expelled them from their homes. Now, Azad's political and interpretive program did not go unchallenged. Indeed, his call for Indian Muslims to boycott the British and to ally with the Hindus and Gandhi precipitated a massive backlash from a number of Indian ulama. But perhaps none was as scathing and comprehensive in his rebuke of Azad and his compatriots in the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements as the prolific North Indian Muslim scholar Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921. It is to his rebuttal of Azad that I now turn. Who was Ahmad Raza Khan? A Hanafi jurist and Qadri Sufi, Ahmad Raza Khan is among the most illustrious personalities in the intellectual history of modern South Asian Islam. He is said to have composed over 1,000 works on various subjects, including law, theology, hadith, philosophy, the Quran, and even the natural sciences. Khan was also the founder of what is known as the Barelvi school of thought in South Asia, named after the northern Indian town of Bareilly in Uttar Pradesh, where he was from. Khan's refutation of Abul Kalam Azad's discourse on the boundaries of interreligious friendship is found in an exegetical work entitled The Convincing Proof on the Mumtahana Verse, Al-Mahajja Al-Mu'tamana fi Aya Mumtahana, published in 1920. Khan was on his deathbed when he wrote this book. He died less than a year after its publication. Ahmad Raza Khan counter-argued that to begin with, the Ottoman state cannot even be understood as a legitimate caliphate. Why? Because it lacked prophetic lineage, or more specifically, the lineage of Prophet Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh. Moreover, taking a more pragmatic stance, he took strong exception to Azad's call for jihad against the British. Such foolhardy confrontation against a monstrously powerful colonial state will only invite self-destruction, Khan had argued, while speculating that such catastrophic ideas were planted by Gandhi as part of his designs to politically and financially cripple Indian Muslims. But most critically, and most relevant to the argument I've been trying to develop here, Khan disagreed vehemently with what he saw as the encouragement of Hindu-Muslim intimacy in the public sphere. Not only was Azad wrong in characterizing Hindus as a community that had never attacked Muslims, for they certainly had done so during multiple episodes of communal violence, but more significantly, legitimating Hindu-Muslim friendship left vulnerable to erasure public markers of Muslim distinction. Again, this key category I mentioned earlier, public markers of Muslim distinction, or Sha'air Islam. Khan was especially livid, for instance, when leaders of the Khilafat movement once invited Gandhi to a mosque on a certain Friday to address the congregants. Handing over to a Hindu the elevated and coveted site of the pulpit crystallized an attitude of complete disregard for markers of Muslim distinction that, in the absence of political sovereignty, indexed sovereign power and the promise of preserving religious identity against the threat of competing others. If left unchecked, Khan warned, the day was not far off when the leaders of the Khilafat movement would make Indian Muslims worship Gandhi as part of their religious lives. So my main point, the take-home point from this discussion is this. In contrast to Azad, who had sought to recover the dwindling crescent of Muslim imperial sovereignty in the institution of the Caliphate, Khan located Muslim sovereign power squarely in the realm of ritual practice and the choreography of the everyday. For the latter, it was not the resurrection of a Muslim state, but the cultivation of markers of Muslim distinction in the public sphere that enshrined sovereignty in the ruins of empire. Example number 2. And on that, and a few concluding comments, I will end my talk. This example, the title is Bovine Politics and Interreligious Hospitality. Another issue of contention that will further clarify this point is that of cow sacrifice, arguably the most vexatious subject of dispute among the Indian Muslim scholarly elite in the early 20th century. Recently, as you must see in the news and elsewhere, Hindu nationalist discourses and majoritarian violence directed against minorities like Muslims and Dalits as part of the cow protection movement have attracted tremendous scholarly and journalistic attention as well as alarm. But investing affective and political attachments in the body of the cow as an index and marker of religious purity and superiority is not a solely Hindu phenomenon. The cow has represented a site of tremendous anxiety and opportunity for competing groups of prominent South Asian Muslim scholars as well, for at least a century. In addition to scholarly debates, controversies over the cow question also populated in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the popular press and other venues of popular culture in South Asia. So to just give you a break from my voice, I'll just share screen here and show you an image. I hope you can see this. So this comes from, this picture is from a November 1881 issue of the satirical Urdu magazine called Awadh Punch, which was based on a magazine by the similar name called Punch coming out of London. And what we see here is that you have a cow with the face of a donkey, and you have some Muslim butchers pulling it in one direction, and then you have Hindu pundits pulling it in another direction. The title here is Mas'ala Gau Kushi, basically the problem of cow slaughter. And on the top of the cow, of course, is written the word ta'assub, or bigotry or intolerance, basically a modernist sort of satire on the competing religious sensitivities which were invested in the body of the cow in the late 19th century. Back to the ulama and their contest over the cow. The leaders of the Khilafat movement urged abstention from cow sacrifice as a gesture of interreligious hospitality towards the Hindu community, since many of those find the cow to be invested in some sacred properties. This gesture of abeyance, they argued, was crucial for forging a robust political alliance with the Hindus against the British. Their argument was based not on some abstract appeal to pluralism, but on a specific reading of the Islamic legal tradition, drawing on the observation that cow sacrifice is not an obligatory wajib, but only a simply permissible mubah practice in Islamic law. Hence, refraining from it posed no normative pitfalls. Indian Muslims, they argued, can easily substitute cows with goat and sheep for animal sacrifice in both everyday life and on devotional occasions like Eid. This proposal, however, left opposing scholars like Ahmad Raza Khan aghast. Again, of particular interest to me is the reasoning that went into Khan's protest. In another text called The Finest Viewpoint on Cow Sacrifice, Anfus al-Fikr fi Qurban al-Baqar, Khan elaborated that in the context of colonial India, cow sacrifice represented among the foremost signs and markers of Muslim distinction. And since cow sacrifice was known to be a distinguishing marker of Muslim identity in India, it signified Islam's honor and dominance in the public sphere. In the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, it was in ritual life and performance that power was enshrined. In effect, abandoning such a practice for the appeasement or under the pressure of a non-Muslim community like the Hindus amounted to Islam's humiliation, zillat, an outcome that was antithetical to the underlying motif of the Sharia, establishing Muslim dominance over non-Muslims. Therefore, while cow sacrifice was certainly not obligatory in and of itself, according to the Sharia, in the specific context of colonial India, deliberately refraining from this practice as an exercise in interreligious hospitality was certainly impermissible. Why? Because such refrain involved the extinction of a marker of Muslim distinction, and in effect the humiliation of Islam and the elevation of Islam's rivals. Now, here I must avert a potential misreading. While articulating and presuming an imperial Muslim political theology, it is not as if Ahmad Raza Khan or other scholars who shared his views, it's not as if they were some unhinged exclusivists, oblivious to the reality of British colonial power. Exactly to the contrary. Much like his antagonist Abul Kalam Azad, whom I discussed earlier, Ahmad Raza Khan also was not only keenly aware of the looming British presence, but also closely attuned to the opportunities and benefits afforded by that presence. So, for instance, to give just one example among many possible examples, while arguing for the preservation of Muslim markers of distinction, Khan frequently invoked the colonial promise and policy of tolerance towards individual religious communities, and of its commitment to ensuring their freedom of religion, again the same category that Azad had invoked, freedom of religion, mazhabi azadi. Pressuring Indian Muslims to abstain from cow sacrifice, he often proclaimed, represented an abomination that the colonial authorities should never allow. But in trying to demonstrate that precluding Muslims from the ritual of cow sacrifice constituted a breach of religious freedom, he first had to prove that this ritual was indeed legitimately and wholly, quote unquote, religious. This he sought to do by citing numerous Quranic verses and the Prophet's sayings that establish cow sacrifice is among the distinguishing markers of Islam. For instance, the most prominent such Quranic verse is verse 36 of chapter 22, Al-Hajj, that reads as follows: "And as for the sacrifice of cattle, we have ordained it for you as among the symbols of distinction designated by God. وَالْبُدْنَ جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُم مِّن شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ." Having established the religious character of cow sacrifice, Khan proceeded to remind colonial authorities of their duty to honor the principle of religious freedom in an even-handed manner that does not privilege the sensibilities of one group over those of another. Now, Khan was by no means some liberal secular champion of religious freedom as a normative ideal. What we find here instead is a seemingly illiberal actor's strategic deployment of liberal desires and categories for the advancement of his own ideological agenda. Similarly, if a staunch traditionalist like Ahmad Raza Khan was not oblivious to modern colonial conditions and categories, on the other hand, it is not as if scholars attached to the Caliphate movement who argued for Hindu-Muslim friendship and collaboration were some open-ended pluralists unaware of or uninterested in traditionalist ulama logics anchored in the assumption and context of Muslim empire. Take, for instance, the position of arguably the most intellectually formidable protagonist of the Khilafat movement and a leading Muslim scholar of modern South Asia, Maulvi Abdul Bari, who died in 1926 after a short but prolific life of 47 years. Bari was associated with the famous Farangi Mahal school of Muslim traditionalism in South Asia, known for its emphasis on rationalist disciplines like logic and philosophy. Now, even while urging abstinence from cow sacrifice, as a gesture of interreligious hospitality with the Hindus, Bari was at pains to emphasize that such abstention should not issue forth under the pressure or coercion of any non-Muslim community. Why? Because suppressing a public marker of Muslim distinction involuntarily under any pressure or coercion contravened the imperial political theology informing the normative ethos and parameters of the Sharia. But no normative landmines imploded if, for purposes of sacrifice, one replaced cows with other animals like sheep, camels, or goats of one's own volition. How was one to distinguish coercion from volition is an ambiguity Bari did not address. But the point I'm trying to make here is that notice how Bari anchored his whole case for refraining from cow sacrifice on the very category of public markers of Muslim distinction that the opponents of his view, like Ahmad Raza Khan, had mobilized to argue for the necessity of cow sacrifice. How did Bari do that? By claiming that the Caliphate represented a far more critical and monumental marker of Muslim distinction than did cow sacrifice. As he pithily and cuttingly put it, and I quote him here, "What is the cow when put next to the Caliphate?" In a fascinating move, Bari did not contest or try to refute his opponent's claim that cow sacrifice represented an important marker of Muslim distinction in the South Asian context. He readily admitted that yes, it was so. And he also was in agreement with the likes of Ahmad Raza Khan that Indian Muslims must not abandon cow sacrifice under the coercion or pressure of Hindus and their leaders like Gandhi. Instead, he framed his program for forging Hindu-Muslim unity as what he intriguingly termed an exception to the norm, kharqul aada, whereby a marker of Muslim distinction, that of cow sacrifice, was, so to say, itself sacrificed to safeguard a much more vital and coveted marker of Muslim distinction, the Caliphate. In essence, Bari packaged the cultivation of Hindu-Muslim harmony as a departure from the norm, kharqul aada, necessitated by a moment of politico-theological tribulation for the Muslim community with the Ottoman Caliphate under grave threat. And by doing so, and this is the main point I'm trying to make here, he astutely maintained his normative loyalty to the principle of Muslim exceptionalism, while also justifying the temporary exception of Hindu-Muslim friendship precipitated by political necessity. Abandoning cow sacrifice was only a means to a much greater cause, that of guarding the foundational pivot of Muslim identity, the Caliphate. The larger point being, notice the way this intra-Muslim or intra-minority debate over cow sacrifice and Hindu-Muslim friendship involves the thorny negotiation of modern colonial conditions and the legacy of pre-modern Islamic legal imaginaries and assumptions. So to conclude, this challenge of translating a legal discursive landscape tethered to the assumption of Muslim empire in a radically transformed set of political conditions also holds far-reaching implications in the post-colonial moment, for instance, in settings like Pakistan. To give just one among many possible examples, notice the persistence of pre-modern jurisprudential categories in the following comments by the prominent traditionalist scholar of the Deoband school, Muhammad Yusuf Benori, died 1977, in the aftermath of the 1974 amendment to the Pakistani constitution that declared the Ahmadis as outside the fold of Islam. He wrote, and I quote him, "Before the constitutional amendment, the normative status of the Ahmadis was that of hostile unbelievers, kuffar-e muharibin. And after the amendment, their status is that of non-Muslim minorities under the protection of Muslim rule, or in other words, that of dhimmis, on the condition, of course, that they live in Pakistan as minorities and don't lay claim on being a Muslim." End of quote. Again, notice that Benori's mobilization of categories like dhimmi and muharib, hostile unbeliever, clearly indicates that he's operating according to a pre-modern Muslim imperial jurisprudential framework, while simultaneously seeking to align that framework with the calculus of modern state sovereignty. This attempted alignment generates a vexing conundrum. How is one to maintain normative fidelity with the conceptual vocabulary of a discursive tradition that is not so easily translatable into the requirements and protocols of modern citizenship and constitutional rights? Of course, as the Ahmadi example exemplifies, the exclusionary politics and mechanisms of the modern state are often dramatically more violent and durable than the imperial logics of sovereignty governing pre-modern empires. My point, thus, is not to draw a fictitious contrast between pre-modern intolerance and modern liberal tolerance, or to present South Asian ulama as mired in the long-exhausted fiction of Muslim empire. Rather, through these examples, I have sought to highlight an important and perhaps less examined dimension of the problem of interreligious relations in modern Islam, namely the intra-minority debates and tensions generated through the encounter between the legacy of pre-colonial discursive traditions and norms and the conditions and institutions of colonial modernity, and more recently, the post-colonial state. This encounter I've tried to show today has represented a site of considerable aspiration, anxiety, and intellectual fermentation. Ultimately, the analysis presented in this presentation highlights the importance of imagining a horizon of interreligious and Hindu-Muslim friendship that is neither imperiled by pathological inheritances of imperial political theologies and nor leavened by the seductive yet frequently sour promises of modern secular power and state sovereignty. Thank you so much for your patience and for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. SherAli Tareen, for this difficult area. As you see, the subcontinent has produced a lot of such intellectuals in both periods, and the pre and modern periods, and have written a lot on this subject which you are presenting. We are going to open this for Q&A. You can put your question in the chat box, or you can ask directly. Please raise your finger. And I have first finger from Bina Batol. If you can unmute yourself. Bina?
Was just giving a reaction of the clapping, but I did have something to say. So I'll just take this as a godsend. Very enlightening, and especially the last part was very, very fascinating, the way you connected the anti-Ahmadi critique of the Benori school scholar and the way he was bringing out about imperial vocabulary. I do, however, think that maybe there's more to this emphasis on the identity markers. And it is not just about the identity markers in the public sphere regarding consumption of beef or regarding other markers of distinction. I think we can't really simplify it or reduce it to these scholars trying to argue out a Hindu-Muslim friendship simply because they wanted to preserve a ritual distinction. That doesn't seem to add up to your otherwise powerful argument about their use of imperial vocabulary. I mean, will they be using imperial vocabulary simply for a rasm or a ritual? Is that all that they are trying to fend for? that is something that I found did not add up.
I think that's a very good question, Bina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bina.
Dr. SherAli Tareen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And very good to hear from you after many years. Hope you're doing very well. Bina, that's an interesting question. So I'll say two things in response to your question. The first thing I would say is that clearly, I think you're correct that the emphasis on ritual practices is always connected to larger questions of politics. And there is more to these debates. Of course, a lot of this has to do with the contestation over religious authority. Precisely because in the 19th century, in the marketplace of religious persuasion, there are many different claimants to religious authority. So one of the key things that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan is very, furious about is that these very scholars like Ahmad Raza Khan and actually other people in the Khilafat movement who are very, modernist and Western educated in many ways and very critical of the ulama, that these are the very people now who are trying to act all anti-colonial and trying to bring about this kind of anti-colonial activism in politics. So he begins this text, that fragments of which I shared with you today, in talking about, you are the very scholars who are trained and educated in the very Western forms of education and training, and you sort of lampoon us ulama and mock us for being simple just Quran reciters or stuck in some kind of a pre-modern moment, and now you're acting all anti-colonial, etc., and you're bringing destruction upon your own community by having them pick up arms against this powerful colonial force. So he, interestingly, the traditionalist alim, is playing the more pragmatic role of someone who, you don't engage in that kind of warfare. And he says that engage with the British in mere transactional relations, take funding from them for your schools and other operations, while not engaging in substantive friendship. So he takes on a more pragmatic position. So there is that religious authority and that whole contestation around that also as a subtext to this debate. So that's the first thing I would say. Yes, you're correct that these contestations over ritual are connected to much broader political debates, questions of religious authority, and so on. The second part of what I will say in response to your question is, and here I will sort of slightly not disagree, but share my thoughts around that, is that ritual is deeply political and it's deeply important. So what might seem to us as some kind of petty or everyday mundane matter is hugely significant, and in some ways, with the resurrection of a Muslim state being impossible, it is precisely the everyday that becomes the locus of sovereign power, that becomes the locus of how identity is to be preserved and expressed, and through that, some notion of a Muslim sovereign power is to be enshrined. So clearly, your question allows me to further explicate a very important element of the larger argument that I'm trying to make here, which is to think about ritual practice also as deeply political, and to think about these two groups of scholars as articulating different visions of the political in a moment when political sovereignty is no longer available. For leaders of the Khilafat movement, it is galvanizing the Muslim community of South Asia around the symbol and institution of the Caliphate, which they see elsewhere in the Ottoman state. But clearly, it is a nationalist project at the same time. Whereas for thinkers like Ahmad Raza Khan and many others, it is precisely these ritual practices that enshrine politics and the political. The interesting thing is that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, who's a Barelvi scholar, of course, and Barelvis, as you know, are in deep contestation with their arch rivals, the Deobandis, on many different questions to do with the Prophet and other questions. That's what I wrote my first book on. But on this particular question of Hindu-Muslim friendship, there is tremendous overlap. There is tremendous synchronicity between the views of Deobandi and Barelvi ulama, precisely around this whole question of Sha'air-e-Islam, which of course is a much older category in Islam, but takes on a kind of prominence in the modern moment that I don't really see in the texts in, say, the 16th, 17th, 15th century. So what is happening here? Why in the 19th century does Sha'air Allah or Shi'ar-e-Islam become such an important category and important matter of dispute for these scholars? My speculation and my sort of working theory is that clearly the question of the political and the question of sovereign power is being located precisely in the choreography of the body in everyday life. So ritual for them is deeply important, while at the same time agreeing with you that it's connected to much broader and more interest and bigger issues at the same time. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you very much. Next, any question you have? Anyone is asking any other question? Please. Yes, Zaid. Zaid is asking.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, SherAli. Such a always very invigorating to hear you presenting. Just a couple. So a quick. I mean, for one, I just want to say it's incredibly striking to see the resonances and parallel in some ways of the disagreement that's happening around the resistance as being framed in terms of broader kind of direct, what we kind of typically see as the kind of the domain of the political, and as you're putting it, on the other hand, being in the domain of the everyday or the ritual or the epistemological. And in terms of the parallel to the American Muslim context that I study and exist within, in terms of how these debates are playing out between different factions, where there's questions of political resistance to hegemony, and both sides claiming that, and yet it manifests, where that emphasis is placed. Is it about resisting, American imperial power and certain kinds of forms of overt domination and kind of coercion versus, is it about maintaining certain kinds of ritual integrity or preservation of certain kinds of practices and traditions? So that was just as a comment. The parallel there to me is very striking, and I hope I can kind of think about that further. And this was very helpful for me. It raises the question of whether questions of political sovereignty, in what ways questions of political sovereignty are at play in this context when it's even further removed, but which kind of segues into the question I had for you, which is, sorry, sorry, there's a lot going on around me right now. The question was in relation to the issue of the maintenance of identity and everyday practice and ritual. You're noting that it's being framed in relation to sovereignty. The maintenance of your difference as a community is being framed in terms of political sovereignty and sha'air, and the connection between the sha'air al-Islam and that history of imperial political sovereignty as Muslims. I'm wondering, do they use the category, for instance, of tashabbuh? Because I could imagine and very much see playing out in concerns with preservation of your difference as a community that are not tied to a conception in which you have political sovereignty over the public sphere in that way, right? Like preserving your integrity and difference as a community might actually be really important in a minoritarian context, like you were alluding to. It emerges even more in a minoritarian context. And so is it always tied to a conception of sovereignty, or can it be that concern and anxiety over difference and preserving boundaries of difference actually be not, come out in that a concern with tashabbuh not necessarily being about sovereignty in that way?
Right. So that's a terrific question.
Thank you very much, Zaid. Yes.
Yeah. Tashabbuh is very, very critical to these scholars. In fact, in this current book of mine, there are 2 chapters, in fact, on tashabbuh, because it's such a critical issue for these scholars. And there again,
maybe you translate the tashabbuh.
Oh, sorry. It's sort of the imitation of non-Muslim practices, habits, etc. And it comes from this famous hadith, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." He who imitates people becomes one of them. And I should mention, when I'm talking about tashabbuh, that my colleague, my graduate school colleague now at Lafayette, Yusha Patel, has written a really definitive study of this text in the pre-modern context. And it's really drawing from a study that I've mobilized it in the modern context of South Asia. So getting to the heart of your question towards the end, I think it allows me to elaborate and specify that with these kinds of concerns to do with the everyday or to do with identity and difference in terms of everyday practices, clothing and food and rituals and so on. With tashabbur, of course, the major issue is where do you draw the line between what is religious and what is cultural and so on. This allows us to think about sovereign power in a manner which is more expansive than simply political sovereignty reduced to the state. So in some ways, interestingly, when you think about these kinds of scholars and their investment in Muslim distinction and why they find the confusion of distinction to be something very problematic, the key category there, of course, is iltibas. When you confuse distinction, that will always lead to the destruction of your identity, and through that, your power as a community. That allows us to think about sovereign power as the power to decide on the distinction between the friend and the enemy, which is beyond, or in some ways more encompassing than simply political sovereignty, which is exercised by the modern state, which decides on the exception and through that garners its sovereignty. So in some ways, in an interesting way, although the assumption behind something like tashabbuh and its investment is drawing on a pre-modern Muslim imperial imaginary, whereby it is precisely through distinction that you maintain Muslim power, the focus on the everyday makes it possible to think about sovereignty in a manner which is broader and more encompassing than a modern notion of sovereignty, which is limited to the modern state. So in some ways, it is precisely while operating in a Schmittian register of the distinction between the friend and the enemy, but still in some ways, these scholars show the limits of Schmitt also to think about sovereign power in a much broader vein and scope than simply the state and its power to announce the exception and so on. That, to answer your question very specifically, would be the specific answer. But clearly, these debates are very much connected to this broader question of tashabbuh. And on there also, I just want to highlight that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, who's a Barelvi scholar, the founder of the Barelvi school, him, and if you compare his thought with the grandson of the founder of Deoband called Maulana Qasim Nanutwi, his grandson was called Maulana Qari Tayyib, who wrote the definitive book on tashabbuh in South Asia called Tashabbuh fil Islam. It's also been translated into Arabic, very much indebted to Allama Ibn Taymiyyah and his Iqtada Sirat al-Mustaqim. If you compare the thought of Ahmad Raza Khan, the Barelvi founder, and the grandson of the Deoband school, it's almost complete overlap when it comes to this question. So it's interesting to see that when it comes to the question of Muslim, non-Muslim relations, how these otherwise fiercely critical and bitterly opposed scholars actually come together in very interesting ways. And I think what they come together on is precisely the foundational logic and assumptions of a Muslim imperial political theology. But they present it and mobilize it in very creative and interesting ways in the modern moment.
Thank you very much. Said you had, do you have a follow-up question, or is there anybody else want to ask a question before we go to Zaid again?
Someone in the chat has raised a question, Melissa Bent.
Just came in, right, from Melissa.
She says, I'll just read it out for the benefit of audience members. I'm curious about the same question in terms of neoliberal multiculturalism and how it tries to mobilize surface differences in order to pretend inclusivity while maintaining neo-colonial inequalities. Any thoughts? Yeah, Melissa, that's a great question. And what your question allows us to think about is not to fall into the trap of making some kind of a distinction between, liberal tolerance or multicultural acceptance of the other and these traditionalist scholars and their logics that are so invested in establishing difference. They have their own imaginary, they have their own normative protocols and normative goods that they work with. But they can also be very ingenuous in terms of, and very creative in terms of their engagement with the tradition. They don't have to, follow the protocols of a certain kind of a liberal secular template of what constitutes, goodness in the modern world. So there are some similarities, but I would point out that, for example, in the debate that I've explained today, oftentimes it is the modernist Abul Kalam Azad who's calling for jihad against the British and calling for a Muslim caliphal state, which is the Islamist sort of mandate. And it is the traditionalist, so-called conservative alim who's saying, let's go more pragmatic here. Let's not engage in jihad against the British. Let's take funding from them, do our thing. And is invoking the principle of religious freedom. Well, both of them are in different ways. So my main point, the point of this exercise is to really complicate our picture of intra-scholarly, intra-Muslim debates on these questions. They don't follow these kinds of, predictable binaries like inclusive, exclusive, Puritan, populist, modernist, traditionalist, anti-colonial, pro-colonial. Things are much more complicated than that. And we can only get to the complexities if we read their texts closely and energetically. That's basically what I'm trying to do here.
Thank you. Yes, next is, hello? Is I'm saying your name right?
Yes, I am confirming what SherAli has said. Thank you very much. It's very enlightening.
Okay, okay. Zaid, you want to continue, or we have 3 minutes actually left? That would be the concluding remarks, unless you have something important to say. Zaid? I think he mute himself. All right, so
He's fine. He's
3
fine.
minutes are left.
Bina wants to say
Excuse me.
something.
You know, I've been trying to get into this conversation, and somehow or the other I'm being eclipsed. So I'm going to exercise some sovereign, whatever it is, in the audience, and we have 1 or 2 minutes left. So here's my question to you. This guy Khan wanted, you know, not to support the Caliphate because the Caliphate because it was not for Quraysh lineage. So what will guarantee that the new Caliphate that was being proposed would be would have that kind of legitimacy and was being argued for? So that's one question. My second question is simply this: in this debate that you've kind of sketched out, where would you put or situate Iqbal? So those are my questions.
But these 2 questions will take the whole night.
Sir,
minutes left.
Could you let him answer, please?
Can you say briefly in a minute?
Yeah, I'll definitely, very briefly. So on the first question of the requirement of the Quraysh, for Ahmad Raza Khan, a Muslim political state is no longer a possibility, a viable possibility. So he's not really after resurrecting a Muslim state. On the other hand, for Abul Kalam Azad, your question is very interesting because he spends a lot of time in talking about why that requirement about the Quraysh is not a requirement that undermines the case that the Ottomans, in fact, are the legitimate claimants to the Caliphate. And he makes the argument that, one, there have been many caliphs and caliphates in the past that did not have that lineage. For example, he cites Ibn Tumart and others. He cites many thinkers who said that, you know, that requirement is not, in fact, a prerequisite for the office of the caliph. And he says that ultimately the main message of Islam was to destroy what he calls nasab parasti, or, you know, lineage worship. So why are you being so invested in one lineage, and so on? So he takes on this very modernist bent, saying that Islam was the religion that did not distinguish on the basis of ethnicities and tribes, etc. And he actually gives a lesson to the British colonial state that, look, our religion is a universalist, modern democratic religion. So on those points, he makes the argument that the Quraysh requirement is in fact not a requirement. And the last point that he makes is very interesting. He says that the Ottomans are the people who, for the last 4 centuries, have been defending Islam against the threat of Europe more than any other empire, Mughals or Safavids, etc. If Mughals and Safavids exist, it's because of the bravery and courage which is shown by the Ottomans. So they are the most legitimate representatives of the Caliphate. On your last question about where does Iqbal fit into this, clearly Iqbal also has a very interesting way in which he combines ritual with politics. So I think in some ways he's come somewhere in the middle of how you might think about questions of friendship and questions of the relationship between ritual and politics. On some issues, I think he would agree with Ahmad Raza Khan about the threat or the perils of friendship. On the other hand, I think he would also agree with the modernists by saying that one should not be so invested in everyday rituals that one loses sight of the broader purpose of politics. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so very much. And we are closing, but I would like to ask Dr. Hisham Altalib to say a few closing remarks. Dr. Hisham Altalib.
Okay, brother, thank you very much. Very enlightening. Alhamdulillah, I'm really pleased. I am listening to SherAli Tareen. Just one more comment about Al-Faruqi, rahmatullahi alayh, because we are in AAR. He was a pioneer in many things. One of them is that he was the first one to talk about Abrahamic faiths. And he made a great contribution in actually putting the study of Islam as a religion on the same platform like Judaism and Christianity, rather than being taught in most of university at that time, if not all, under Middle Eastern studies. So it was like a religion on the same par as all other religions. And thank you very much. Appreciate all the contributors. Thank you, Dr. Shafiq, a lot.
Yeah, thanks everyone. But I just want to make one small point, and then I think every one of you is that, you know, looking into the history of interfaith dialogue, the Muslims were the first, you know, how to recognize Hinduism as a divine religion at par with Christianity. If it had been a Christian rule over India, India would have been very, subcontinent would have been very different. But you can see how religiously the dialogue happened, and how, you know, that all those, how Ahl Kitab, people of the book, has to be treated, how the Hindus, Buddhists, and others who were living there in the Sikh were treated accordingly. So that is something very, very important when we see in that area. And especially, thank you very much. This is a very difficult area. I know the different scholars approach they have made. You have handled it very well, Dr. Tareen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shafiq. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Dr.
I mean, you did not talk about Iqbal, but Iqbal has its own way. But anyway, that's a very rich area for more research. I mean, for continuing research in that whole area. So thanks everyone who is present here, and it has been recorded, and we need your permission there. And it will be posted on IIIT website for those of your friends who are not here, and you can invite them to watch it. Thanks a lot. Have a good night. Ma salama.
Ma salama. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Fi amanillah.